Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of An Unexpected Fight, a pediatric cancer podcast. Today, Kelly and I are joined by Victoria Porter. She is a licensed clinical social worker and specializes in grief counseling. And we're going to do our episode a little bit different today. So, we are actually going to be reviewing a book I recently found. I don't know how many of you watch superhero movies, but in the movie Deadpool, there is a character who actually lost his son to a pediatric brain tumor. And Deadpool 2 is dedicated to this little warrior. And I found that he wrote a book called A Heart That Works, actually, by Peter Delaney, or Rob Delaney, sorry, his name in the show is Pete. But anyway, so I was reading this book and I was like, man, this is like everything that a parent going through grief thinks and wants to say but doesn't get to say. I will throw a little disclaimer out there that there's quite a bit of language in this book, and just be forewarned if you decide to read it. I'm going to be omitting the explicit words, so if you read it later and you're like, oh, that says a little bit more than what she said on her podcast, that's fine. We're not going to say the bad words on here. But Victoria, I'll let you introduce a little bit about yourself, and then we'll kind of get started.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm a grief counselor. I specialize in grief and loss, and I love the opportunity to A, talk about books, and B, talk about Nora. So I'm just happy to be here. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. So we're just going to kind of dive in. You can't see this, but I have like this entire bookmarked, I think. So we're just going to.
It's the same, yes.
We're just gonna pick some and start, and there's no rhyme or reason to what we're talking about other than I related to all of these sentiments in this book and felt like I wanted to share. Kelly's gonna provide some insight from a pediatric cancer mom whose daughter has survived, but she's also had a lot of friends who haven't made it. So, Kelly, I'll let you kind of say what your role is going to be today.
Yeah, so I wanted to be here kind of on an outsider's perspective of somebody who has not lost their child, but is around a lot of friends and people who I know who have lost their children. And sometimes it's hard to find the right things to say. So I'm going to throw some questions towards Tiffany and Victoria about, what should we say? How should we approach this? How they kind of navigate grief. So that'll be my role today.
So I'm just going to kind of start towards the front of the book. Probably one of my favorite analogies that he did, I'm going to save for a little bit later because it's a little bit heavier of a topic. But so I'm just going to kind of start with, he talks a lot about brain fog and how he felt after his son died. And so, even during the process as well.
So Tiffany, give a little background on, so his son's name is Henry. Does he have the same type of cancer that Nora had?
No, I finally found it in there. I kept looking, but it was a grade 3 epididyoma.
Okay.
Ependymoma.
I wondered that. Okay.
Ependymoma, yeah.
Ependymoma.
Yeah, so grade 3 is going to be a higher proliferation rate, a higher risk brain tumor, kind of harder to get rid of in a first lack of better understanding. And
I think Henry was 1 when he was diagnosed.
He was 1 when he was diagnosed. Kelly's daughter was around the same age as Nora, so both of our children were infants, 10 months old at diagnosis, and so we also share that being younger children. Also, like in this book, Henry had just turned 1 when he got his diagnosis. So
it was incredibly relatable for you. I know you texted me after you started reading this book because I had cautioned you and said, it's really, really kind of heavy and hard. And I'm a grief therapist and I had to step away from this a little. And so like maybe a few hours later, you were like, oh my gosh, it's the most thing I have ever related to. Which I think is why we're talking about it, right? Because in the realm of what you guys have been through, being able to relate to something on that level is so important. And that's kind of the message we want to get to people. If you've been there, this is a great book for you.
Yes, absolutely. Because despite you probably think these explicit words, but you don't say them out loud because,
right. That's how you feel. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. He goes, first, whenever he heard his diagnosis, he had been sick for a couple of months, throwing up Henry, and he goes in to talk about, he starts questioning his parenting, and he says, in chapter 3, on page 23, he says, "Did I question my parenting and letting him eat so many blueberries now floating in his puke? Sure. Was I a lazy parent, and had I just let him keep eating them because it kept him quiet? Probably. But I'm pretty sure I let him eat chorizo before he was 9 months old." And he goes on to talk about, he let him do all these things, and he starts questioning, did I do all the wrong things? Did I cause this tumor? Did something I did make my child sick? And I think that that's something any cancer parent goes through, not even just to a bereaved parent, but any cancer parent goes through that. Is this something I did? Because this isn't supposed to happen. My child was healthy until they weren't. And he talks about whenever he was...
I don't know if I ever shared this with you, Tiffany, but you're right. Even not as a bereaved parent, I go through that guilt on a regular. Riley had really bad reflux shortly after she was born, to the point when she had a little, what is it called now? Esophageal, like atresia. Basically, her airway was kind of still floppy and would close when she would reflux. So they said this is kind of a severe form. She turned blue a couple times. That's how we figured it out. And they put her on Zantac. And Zantac has since been recalled for causing cancers. There is nothing in the studies that show that it's linked to brain cancer, but you bet every day, I wonder. There's no way to prove it. There's no way to, I can't really research it myself right now. There's nothing out about it yet. But that's one of those things I think every parent, like you said, every cancer parent wonders.
And I think it's so interesting that, Rob, like you have some logical basis for your questions, but Rob is like, is it the blueberries?
Right.
How crazy it is when you get thrown into a situation like this. Like, it just makes no sense.
Absolutely.
And then he talks about he goes on in this chapter to talk about when he went to the doctor, and they kept going back to the doctor and going back to the doctor. And he finally gets to this doctor, and the doctor says, "Does he just vomit, or is there something that precedes the vomiting?" Mm-hmm. And he's like, "No, it's effortless." And then his doctor said, "Well, we need to get an MRI to see what this could be." And Rob goes, "What, like a tumor?" And the doctor said, "I'm glad you said it." And it's like, that just shows how us as a society are afraid to tell people what we think. And that really resonated with me, because nobody wanted to believe it was a tumor that was causing Nora's symptoms, when I knew in my heart that it was not something that was going to be easily fixed.
And so I'm curious, because Tiffany, you work in the medical field. Is that something that are you ever trained on, how to deliver news like that, or how does that ever happen? No. Oh wow.
They don't teach you how to do that in school. That's just something that you either have to be good at or you're not. And from experience, the people that dealt with me were not. I feel like I'm fairly decent at it, talking with my oncology patients when they get bad news. I'm not looking at my shoes, and I'm not avoiding the hard conversations. It's conversations that you have to have. But the ICU doctors, whenever they told me Nora was going to die, or basically they couldn't get her off the vent, which I knew meant she was going to die, they were looking at their shoes like, it was, my husband is confused because he doesn't understand what they're mumbling about while they're looking at their shoes. And that was something that I wish I could have had on video to show people this is not how you approach hard conversations.
Right. And I think we have to change that narrative that we're having some type of training, even if it's not, perhaps we're having an entire, semester of a class on that. But at some point there has to be some type of, and I know you can't teach empathy, but I think we talk about some positive things that come out of these horrible situations, and you relate to Rob so much because he gets it. And thankfully, there are people working in the medical community that have had losses, and they get it too. But until you've kind of walked in those shoes, you have no idea how to approach someone in this situation. So let's help and do some training on this type of thing, because we have to normalize that we're all going to die. We're all going to know someone that dies. We have to have these conversations.
And sometimes it's not the natural order in which people die.
Oh, and he talks about this a lot in the book too.
Yes,
It's kind of later. I'm sure we'll get to that. But right. It's hard for anybody to talk about children dying, doctors included.
So this brings me to my point, and y'all, I'm not gonna lie to y'all, this like hit me so good. This was like probably my favorite part of the book. But for y'all who have never been through this, if you're listening, you're gonna be like, this woman has lost her mind. But this is truly, I can tell you,
I know what you're about to say.
This is truly how grieving people feel. But he starts this chat on page 8. He says, sometimes doctors and nurses can't fix what's wrong. Sometimes children die. And then on page 9, he says, why do I feel compelled to talk about it, to write about it, to disseminate information designed to make people feel something like what I feel, what my wife feels, what my other sons feel? Done properly, it will hurt them. Why do I want to hurt people? And I do. And he says, did my son's death turn me into a monster? And then a little bit later, he says, I genuinely believe, whether it's true or not, that if people felt a fraction of what my family felt and still feels, they would know what this life and what this world are really about. Not infrequently, I find myself wanting to ask people I know to imagine a specific child of theirs dead in their arms. If you have more than one child, it's crucial you pick one for this exercise. If you're reading this and you have a child, do it now. Imagine them in your arms. Tubes are coming out of various holes, some are which are natural and some are which have made from a scalpel. The mess coming out of some of these tubes. There are smells, the temperature of your child's body is dropping, no breath, none of the wiggling that seems to be the main activity of kids, no heartbeat. Even just that, imagine searching for your child's heartbeat and you can't find one. Their heart will never beat again. It's not a nightmare you can wake up from. And then he goes on with this analogy for a bit longer, and then he says, where would we do it? In the kitchen? So there's some, he uses kind of humor, and I know that sounds so harsh to want to tell people, but like you want someone to understand. And so for a bereaved family, I feel like my lifeline has been other parents who have been through what I've been through, because truly people want to understand what you're going through, but they just don't.
I feel that. I want to understand. So one of my really close friends who Riley went through treatment with her daughter, she lost her child and I didn't. And there is something called survivor's guilt. I've learned in the pediatric cancer world, where you feel guilty in a way that your child survived. I mean, my daughter had stage 4 brain cancer. She isn't theoretically supposed to be here. So when we talk about it, it's hard. I have that guilt, but my friend always says, I appreciate, Kelly, that you still say her name. I appreciate that you still talk about her with me, that you just will randomly message me and say, hey, I'm thinking of you. And this made me think of your daughter today. And I'm not going to use her name for the video just because I didn't ask her permission, but that, you still, it's something that's always on your mind. And that makes me happy. So that's one of the questions I had for you both, is as a bereaved parent, as somebody who's lost a child, is there a right and a wrong way to talk about them? Do you prefer when people ask you directly how you want to talk about your child? Do you appreciate when people bring your child's name up? And, I just want to hear your thoughts on that, because I think there's a lot of people who probably feel that way.
Okay, Tiffany, can I speak on this for just a second?
Please.
Because Rob actually talks about this in the book on page 93. You may have a note on that as well. But he said, I love it when people bring up Henry. If they worry, I assure them they're not really bringing him up at all. I was probably already thinking about him anyway. Right. And it's like, and there's another part, it's right in the beginning of the book where he talks about, you can forget that I lost my son, and then you can remember, and then you can forget. And then, and he said, yeah, like, I never forget that. I remember that every moment of every day. And I think that that's the important part here. Parents who've lost their child just want their child to be talked about, to be remembered. May that person cry when you bring up their name? Does that ever happen with you, Tiffany? Is that I'll turn it over to you now, and like, what do people? Oh, and plus, let's come back to this because I want to talk about the stupid things that people say. So we're going to come back to that quote that you just read. But speak to how you feel about that for a minute.
Yeah, so I've posted many times on my social media stuff about how I find it odd how I think about Nora all the time, like literally all the time. And I still continue to function and still continue to go about my day-to-day activity. And then I think I don't ever have a time where I think to myself, ugh, I haven't thought about Nora in, 3 hours. Like that doesn't exist. Just like you think about any of your children, I feel like they're always on your mind. You always think about them. And so whether they're here or not, I think you're always thinking about them. And like you said, Victoria, like, do people get upset and cry about thinking about their child or when they hear their name? Probably so. I do that probably a lot less frequently now. I actually had a friend message me the other day. So I always dress Nora in like these handmade, like uh, bright, colorful outfits. And I loved Lisa Frank as a child. And so her 1-year-old birthday outfit I had like custom made with like these Lisa Frank pants and a big bow. And one of my friends sent me a little girl's outfit that was Lisa Frank, and she was like, Nora would have loved this. And I told her, I was like, thank you.
Yeah.
Still sad.
Yeah.
But thank you for thinking about seeing that and thinking about Nora. That's what matters.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's hard. It's still hard.
Yeah. Always will be.
Because I would have loved to put her in that little Lisa Frank outfit. But
I want to speak to what he said about, I found it incredibly powerful whenever he said, just if you have more than one kid, pick one of those. Just pick the one that you would be okay with dying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that speaks to the stupid things that people say whenever they say, well, at least you have more children. Yeah. At least you have other children. Yet you can imagine picking one of your children and them not being alive. So don't say that. Don't ever say it. Like we've talked about this before. I think on the last podcast about what people say, and I said if your sentence starts with "at least," you just need to not say whatever it is you're going to say.
That's a great for pre-thought. You're gonna say "at least." That's not going to be a good thing that you need to discuss.
Yes, just don't
People say all kinds of silly things. And
another one I hear a lot is families referring to a child as an angel. I'm curious how you feel about that, referring to them as an angel, or I know for sure, I know your thoughts on it and I know my thoughts on it, but I've also heard people use the term they're in a better place, which I feel like as a mom would break my heart, but I want to hear from you.
So, I deal with this a lot in grief therapy, and this is a this is a whole nother podcast we can do on because I think that you have to do what works for you. And if it helps you to think that your child is in a better place, then that's okay. But we need to not say that to a bereaved parent, because I can tell you that a bereaved parent is thinking, there's no better place than them to be here with me.
In my arms. Yeah.
Right. And if God's plan is that they're not here with me, then I'm not sure I want to be part of this plan. I think, and that is a huge struggle that a lot of my clients deal with. I would really say probably 75%. And I've had some who, have left their church because this completely shatters their assumptions about their belief system. So it is a difficult place for parents to be in. And it's so different. We were talking about this natural death, Tiffany. You said that earlier, because your child dying before you is never something that you're going to be able to conceive happening in your mind. I know, I'm married, and as we get older, my husband and I talk about, one of us dying, and we know it's conceivable that I will lose my spouse at some point. But have we ever talked about my daughter dying? No, we cannot conceive that our child would die before us. It's never a conversation that we have ever had, or I'm a grief therapist, and we still probably will never have that conversation. But are there instances in which we feel like the person is in a better place? I worked in hospice for many years, saw a lot of people suffering, especially whenever it's someone who's older. I think you can feel that sense of peace that they are in a better place. And I just challenge people to think that maybe sometimes it's appropriate, but with bereaved parents, perhaps it's not helpful to say things like that.
I think it's a fine line. I mean, being a Christian woman myself, I do believe that Nora's in heaven. But do I want her there instead of here with me? No, I don't. And so that's not something that comforts me. But I do know that. But it's not a comforting sentiment, which is what I think the goal of them saying that is to try to be comforting.
Yes.
And that in particular is not comforting. I will also caution in this book, this fellow is not a Christian guy, and in the very back that he talks about that. So, for those who know me and know that I am a Christian woman, my belief system is not the same as this fellow's, but we can all agree that child loss sucks. And that we can still have some of the same sentiments and feelings, even if we have different belief systems. But, in his book on page 167, he actually talks about the order of death, and he talks about how grief fatigue is really terrible. And then he says, naturally, when Henry died, I knew it 1,000 times harder. Not only would I die, but my kids would die. And the order in which that happened was not up to me. I tried in the past to engage in some humility here and there, but having your child die is brutally humbling. And so it really does put into perspective, anyone can die at any time and nobody gets to pick when that time is. And so,
and so
it's hard.
Let's segue this into him talking about his father. I'm I made some notes on this. Okay. So on page 131 and 132, you may have flagged this as well, Tiffany.
I'm certain I flagged the whole book.
I know. Me too. It's amazing. It really is. So he's talking about his father is diagnosed with cancer. And he, of course, is sad and upset, and he doesn't want his father to die. But, here's some of that kind of language that he talks about, because, he's like, and I'll read a quote, and of course, we're going to bleep out the cuss words, but he's 73 and has cancer, which is a normal thing that happens. I love my dad and I want people to care about him and ask about him, but maybe they could add a preamble or take out a laminated card that bears some disclaimer saying they agree and understand that it's harder and worse to lose your child to cancer than your dad. Then they can talk about my dad's cancer. Right. And I think that's why it's okay to be angry, and it's appropriate to cuss about that. But, losing someone to cancer at 73, yes, it is an incredible loss, but it is very different than losing a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old to cancer. And we need to stop when someone brings up a topic like that. We need to stop saying, yeah, my dad died of cancer when he was 90. Not helpful, not helpful at all.
Tiffany and I have had this conversation actually, and I can't tell you how many times when somebody learns that Riley had cancer, they say, "Oh, my grandmother or my mom or so and so," and I just smile and nod, because in my head I'm like, that's not comparable. But you're right. I know they mean well, but yep, I've heard that quite a bit too.
Yeah. So on the don't do, and on the same lines of talking about adults with cancer, he also said in that same section, he said about, my dad's 73, he's a dad, he's a grandpa. Now is the time in his life where I fully expect him to contract some life-threatening illness. And I was like, yes, yes, like those things are expected. But then he goes on later on in the book, this was on page 148, 149, he talks about what someone said to him. And he said, let's see. Oh, here it is. He said he had remembered receiving a conversation involved a guy telling him his grandfather had also had a brain tumor, but he survived. So he said, "Are you kidding me? I wouldn't care if a 90-year-old grandfather got hit by 3 buses and fell in a meat grinder. Grandfathers are supposed to get tumors and die. That's their job. What kind of grandfather isn't walking around loaded with tumors? None I want to meet. Grandparent deaths are like practice deaths, a step above pet deaths, and to help you have the best preparation for a truly painful death. And this guy's grandfather didn't even have the decency to die." Yeah, and I laugh, and y'all probably think, right, "Oh my God, this woman's a sincere lunatic." But seriously, though, whenever I compare the loss of my grandparents, which is sad and it's hard, and it's a change in your life, but comparing that to the death of my daughter doesn't hold a candlestick or a drop in a bucket compared to the pain I felt to lose a child. And so I think he does a really superb job of explaining things like that. So things right, not to say are, don't tell us that your grandparent had cancer or your dog had cancer, and then for sure not if they lived. I mean, right, unless we're just making conversation about cancer, which in case that's fine. But if we're talking about death and you're putting your likeness of your pet dying to my child, we're not going to see eye to eye on that.
Right. And I think that this is one of the great things about this book is that I've never published a book. I don't know how that works, but I just would imagine at some point your editor is like, maybe we should word this in a nicer way, or you might offend somebody if you say something like that. But oh no, it is all in here. He held nothing back, and one of the things that I love about it is the dark humor. And he talked about it a lot between him and his wife, and also his sister, right, Tiffany? So his sister, Maggie, her husband died by suicide right in the midst of all of this going on. And that was incredibly devastating, for the family and for Rob, because he couldn't go be present for her in a way that he wanted to because he was in the hospital. Henry was in the hospital for a solid year, right? I think. And I think that is the dark humor. Like, they laugh about it a lot. I don't think I wrote it down, but do you remember where they're laughing about how they rate people's replies? Talking about Henry's death, and so he and his wife would kind of rate from 1 to 10 where their reaction would be. So, I mean, can you speak to that in some way? I'm sure that's just kind of a coping skill that you either laugh or cry.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely two different kinds of people who deal with grief. I'm obviously on a very different side than somebody who still can't say their child's name without getting upset 3 years later. I put in a lot of hard work into grief therapy and to working on myself as a bereaved parent, and I can't speak highly enough about going to counseling, getting help. Don't just sit there and wallow and curl up in a ball, because firstly, that's not what your child would want. That's not what Nora would have wanted for me. And I don't think that anyone's child would want them to not live their life because they're no longer here. But I think there's two very distinct different types of people who grieve. And I think for me, if I don't laugh about something that's dark, then I'm going to be crying about everything, because like I've lived through hell.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't put that into some type of perspective, like he talks about, him and his wife like to go watch horror movies and they laugh when things happen in the horror movie, because they're like, of course they would die, and it's just a very like a dark humor, like you said. And but I think that there's also people who are grieving that probably can't do a book like they wouldn't be able to read this book. They can't listen to stuff like that because it may be too dark. They may not find the humor in it that I do, and it's not even really humor. It's relatability. It's because I relate so deeply to this book. It makes me laugh because somebody else really truly understands on like a molecular level of how I feel, and it's comforting in a way. What did he say? I talk about this a lot, about rainbow emotions is the way that he described it. He says we have a rainbow of emotions, and he doesn't know which color corresponds to what emotion, but you would think red is anger, blue is sadness, and so forth. And he says it's all a part of me now, and it should be. Grief colors my happy moments now, even my milestones. And I think that that's just something that I try to get people to understand. Like, I am genuinely happy. I'm a happy person. I spend a lot of time laughing and a lot of time doing things that I love. But all of that is always covered with a cloud. And I don't think that people understand, like, you can be happy, but you can also be sad at the same time. You don't always have to just be one thing. And just because I'm happy doesn't mean that there's not a part of me that is always going to feel like there's something missing.
I like to use the metaphor of that 50% happy, 50% sad. And I think that you a lot of grief work is coming to accept that you're going to live with that feeling for the rest of your life, because you will have great moments of joy. And as soon as you feel that joy, you're going to be sad that your child is not there, or the person that you love is not there to enjoy that with you. And I think sitting with that is really an adjustment. And some people don't adjust well to that. And that's where I think, like you were talking about, Tiffany, there's things that you can do to help yourself. Sometimes we really do have to do some work and get past that. And I also want to speak to meaning making, because you opened a foundation in your daughter's name. You do a lot of work and have poured a lot of your anguish, I think, into doing that. And whenever we can make some kind of meaning of, especially a child's death, that is very healing to be able to do that.
He also talked about in his book about Makaton, which is a language that children that can't speak and are too young to sign, like they point at pictures, I think is the way it sounded to me. But he goes on this show called CB's Bedtime Story, and after Henry died, they asked him to read this, and he says that he gets on here and he starts to get upset, and the producer's like, do we need to take a break? And he says no, I don't need to take a break. I'm remembering my son, Henry, and that makes me sad. But I want to do this to better others. And so, it's kind of the same story with me. It's like, yeah, it's sad and it hurts and it sucks to see these kids who are diagnosed with cancer all the time. But to me, that's what I want to help fix, is something that I had to go through personally to better society.
And so just a little disclaimer, he's in London, because I know a lot of people won't understand what these shows and things are. But he moved his little family to London to shoot a TV show, and so this all happened like they had no family there. They were just kind of adrift. He's there just working, and then they get this diagnosis. And Tiffany, and both of y'all, I think, since you're both Tiffany and Kelly, I'm sure that you identify with this, because I found it really kind of shocking. On page 87, he's talking about Henry has really kind of a life-threatening infection. And so they get sent over to the hospital in the ambulance, zooming through town with the lights on and everything. And so, he and his wife Leah are there, and he says, once we settle on a plan, Leah dashed off to run Eugene over for his 6th birthday party. So, I mean, just comprehending what that life is like, that you have one child in the hospital and you're so kind of used to these difficult situations happening, that one parent stays there with him and the other parent just goes on and goes to the other child's birthday party.
Absolutely.
I'll let you take that, Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, you still have to live life, you still have another child to be there for, to be present for. It's not easy acting as if nothing. I've told Tiffany this, and I think we've talked about it in previous podcasts. One of the most difficult times for me was actually leaving the hospital and being done with treatment. Because you go back to what people think is just going to be normal life now. And it's really, your new normal is never what it once was, right? But you can't, I guess you have a choice to make. You can lock yourself in a room and cry in a corner all day long, or you can continue to try to do life in this new normal. And to try to keep it normal that actually brings me to a question too in a second, but to try to keep it normal for your other children as well, because cancer doesn't just affect the parents or the child who has cancer. It affects the entire family. Pediatric cancer, I think that's one of the hardest things about pediatric cancer too, versus cancer that's affecting somebody who's aging and we expected it. This is affecting young children and their young siblings, who now might live with a ton of anxiety and emotions that they're navigating. Which one of my questions was, if you have other children, which Tiffany, I know you have Zane, how do you prefer others approach conversations with him about their sibling? Because that's something that also, we've talked a little bit about bringing Nora up and bringing these children up and talking about them, and how that makes you feel joy, even if you also feel sad. But how do you prefer people talk to Zane about normal?
That's a really tough question.
It is.
Because Zane is very closed off. He doesn't like to show emotions. And, I've talked some about that, probably not a whole lot, but he tells me he doesn't like to talk about things that are sad because he might cry. And even though I tell him it's okay to cry, and, he sees me cry, I try to do better about that, because in the beginning, I tried not to cry around him because I didn't want his life to feel always overshadowed with sadness. And so I've realized through the grief process that may not have been the best approach to take. However, I recently, if I get upset about something, I do cry around him. And I don't remember what happened a few weeks ago, but I got upset about something, and he asked me, Mama, what are you crying about? And I said, I just miss Nora, buddy. And I said, and it's okay to cry. And he goes, oh, okay. and, he kind of moves on, but if somebody asks him about Nora, he normally will answer very quickly and quietly and shuts off to that. So I prefer, if they ask Zane about Nora and he acts that way, to not bring it up further, not push it. But I don't mind her being brought up around him or to him, just to kind of like read how he responds to said emotions. So Rob actually talks about sibling trauma at the very end of his books, and he says, I still worried about Henry's brothers. I worried his death would them up irreparably. I called my friend Todd, who experienced terrible tragedy in his childhood. When he was very young, his dad went to their flooded basement and got electrocuted. After some time, he remarried. His mom remarried, and he called him Dad. And then his second dad died from cancer. This was all before Todd turned 6. And he talks about going on to basically, talks a little bit more about his life. But he said, as long as you were there for them, just be present and squeeze them, was his advice. So just letting your children know that you're there, I think, is important. Zane knows that he can talk about Nora anytime that he wants, with me or his dad, and that conversation will never be turned off. And he knows that we will always love him no matter what. And I think that, for siblings, that's just the most important thing to remember. Is just, that was a really long answer to your question, but
no, it was a great answer, though. I think anybody listening who's going
just
through
be
this,
cautious of siblings. If you bring them up, read their body language and just don't continue to push if they seem hesitant to continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
And I want to speak to that for a second as a grief therapist, because statistically, siblings are the least recognized of any grieving group. I know I've worked with siblings, and so, they will say, people will come up and ask them, how's your mom and how's your dad? But nobody asks them, how they're doing after their sibling died. So just this will be a continuation for the rest of their life. And I think that it's important that we as parents check in on them. And even if it's been 10 years later, I don't think we can just assume that they're doing okay. Because there will be ages and stages. Maybe it's when they graduate high school. Even if they've lost their whenever they were 6 and they lost their 3-year-old brother, maybe it's that, they're not getting to do things with their sibling that they thought that they, kind of foresaw what their life would be like. And it's not like that. So I would, just speaking on the grief therapist perspective, I just encourage continuing to check in and not assuming that they're okay for a lifetime. And as they get older, I would encourage them to maybe for themselves to do something that they might find meaningful in honor of their sibling, or for them to do some grief work themselves, whatever that may look like. But it is a lifelong. I have clients now who lost their sibling when they were quite young. And what happens, and so this could have been like 20 years ago, and they're in grief therapy now talking about the impact that death had on their family. Because a lot of times, unfortunately, families don't survive the loss of a child. A divorce can happen. It can fracture in so many ways, and that can impact them, for their lifetime. So it's just important to continue that conversation forever, honestly.
I agree. That's good.
Can I speak to something, Tiffany? I think this is really important for both of y'all for us to talk about. So on page 73, Rob has just a footnote where he talks about advice for people who have a friend or relative with a very sick kid. And so I think we hear this a lot. Let me know if you need anything. Is there anything you need me to do? And he's basically saying, You asking that question, I think his exact words were, it's like yawning in their face. So, and he says, don't ask, just show up. Whatever that is, if it's you're bringing food or you come over to babysit and, watch, do whatever you need, mow the yard, whatever that is. He says, don't ask because, and I want y'all to speak to this because he's like, we don't really even know what we need. We just need our kid to be okay, so we can't even conceptualize or let you guys know what it is we need because we don't know ourselves.
I'll start. I can relate to that. I got that a lot when Riley, especially when she was in active treatment. Let me know what we can do for you. Let me know if there's anything that'll help. And I, in my head, my thought was, I didn't think that's a yawn in my face. That's funny. I like that. But I did think, how do I respond to that? How do sure, there's a lot you could do for me. In that moment, you're navigating so many different things. You're in, you might be in the hospital for days or months at a time. You have brain fog. There's so much going on that you hardly remember to feed yourself, let alone try to recognize the needs elsewhere that you have. I think the best thing that people did for us was, we had a couple of friends who sent like Grubhub gift cards. They didn't ask, what do you want to eat? Or can I set up a meal train? They just were like, here's some gift cards for some Grubhub. That way you get to pick on your terms. Or wrote a letter. Some of my nursing colleagues that I used to work with, they wrote a spiral notebook and they wrote funny stories on every page. And I sat there in the hospital just laughing one night until 2:00 in the morning. And it was the first time I'd laughed in probably a month because I was devastated. And, so just doing something like that. But you're right. I think just taking that initiative. I don't know that I'd say show up at somebody's house and be like, hey, I'm here to babysit, because obviously they might not be ready for you in that moment. But instead of saying, let me know if you need anything, maybe saying, hey, if you need help with your other child, here's the days next week I'm available: Tuesdays, Wednesday, Thursday. Let me know anytime. I'll come over for 2 hours. Like that, even that to me is more meaningful than just let me know. So
I feel like people had groceries delivered to our house. That was very helpful. Like just paper towels, toilet paper, household necessities. I had sometimes just people would come up to the hospital and just sit with me. It was a little more difficult because we were still during COVID. I bet you were too, Kelly.
Yeah, we were COVID
but
time.
We could only have one visitor at a time. But I'd have friends that just would say, "Hey, I'm going to come up and sit with you," for a couple of hours, and I loved that. I had a friend that just came over and cleaned my house. Those are probably going to be your more close friends, not just an acquaintance. One thing I've recommended for families whenever they want to do something for a cancer family who's just gotten a new diagnosis, if they've been in the hospital for a while, I'm like, just get them a cleaning service and just let that cleaning service go clean their house. That way it's a professional coming in. It's not like you trying to enter their house if you don't really know them very well. And I could set that up on my own terms. They called and paid for it, and they told me just to call and schedule it when I was ready.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we had, the community rallied around us like I've never seen before. Our church family was amazing. Our pastors, they would drop anything and come up. I'll tell y'all a really embarrassing story. Y'all just buckle in for this. This is like just about people coming out. So Nora was vomiting her guts up for like 3 days. I was like, I'm about to have to take her back to the hospital. We'd just been home, and she's just vomiting her guts up. And I'm like, I do not want to go back to the hospital. Like, I was like, I can't go back there right now. And so I called my pastors and I'm like, can y'all just pray for her? And they were like, we're on our way. So they like come over to the house. About as soon as I called them, like within the next 5 minutes, she stops throwing up. I'm like, oh, I'm like, okay, we're making some progress here. I sit her in her little high chair, which is like actually back behind me in this corner. For those of you who don't know and who can't see, in this video I record, and my desk is in Nora's room to help remind me why I do all of this. But she's sitting in this high chair. She's just, and then I hear the doorbell ring, and then I hear my Roomba coming around behind me as I smell something, and my dog had thrown up all over the floor, which looked like poop and smelled as such, as my Roomba's like running through it, and my pastors are at the door. And I was like, could this really get any worse? Like, open the door, my house smells like, rotten eggs. And my pastors are like, let us help you. And I'm like, no, I'm like, please, actually just go ahead and go away. But they're like, no. And so they're like cleaning up my dog poop smelled. I was like, this is the most embarrassing thing I've ever been through in my life. But the point is they just came. It was like, I just needed somebody to tell me I was okay, and then it was all going to be okay, and just sit there for a second. And anyway, so that was terribly embarrassing to me. But, it was like, surround yourself with people who are going to clean up your Roomba's dog vomit mess is basically my point to this story. Just having the community support around you to just kind of jump in there, whatever, and like, don't wait on somebody to ask you for something. Kind of like he said, it's like, offer a few things. Say, hey, I can do XYZ. Would you like any of these things right now? Or tell me a time when you would like one of these things. And instead of just saying, hey, just let me know if you need anything, because that really isn't helpful at all. I completely agree with that.
I think it's important to allow people to help you. I hear this a lot now in grief therapy, and I also heard a lot whenever I worked in hospice. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to trouble anybody, and I don't want to bother anybody. But the reality is that you are not a burden, and the people that care about you, it gives them an incredible meaningful experience to be able to help someone in a difficult situation like this. So I think we need to just kind of take that out of our vocabulary, that I don't want to be a burden. You are not. Just allow the help and ask for help too. Sometimes people just don't know what to do. So you can ask them and they will show up, as you know, Tiffany, Kelly.
Absolutely.
People will show up for you.
So I've got, just two more things that I really wanted to point out from this book. We're getting kind of close to an hour already, which is crazy. So there's definitely probably going to have to be a part 2 to this conversation. But, one of the things that he said in his book that I want people listening to really think about is how many times that you think this. He says, how lucky are we to have 3 healthy kids? All 3 of them are healthy. Not every kid in the world is healthy, but these 3 are. We are so fortunate. And then he says, yes, I really thought that, and probably said that to a lot of people too. Basically, that's his, you think that to yourself, and you just really don't know when your world could be turned upside down. I think that it's important to keep that into perspective, that like, yes, you do have healthy children right now, but to keep in the back of your mind, like, that could change at any point. And to just really make my point in that is to make the most of everything that you have with your children all the time, to be patient with them and be kind, and remember that they are children, and that, we as adults can get frustrated and short-tempered. And I really have to remind myself that with Zane, sometimes when I want to be frustrated, I just think, how happy would I be to be frustrated at Nora right now? But I don't get that opportunity. And so it really changes your perspective whenever you think, if your child were to walk outside and something happened to them, like, is that the last thing that you want them to hear from you? And then, the last thing, kind of tying this all back into why we do this too. He has like a whole page about, the awful pediatric cancer statistics, and about how little funding it receives, and about the lack of research for pediatric brain tumors specifically is what he mentions in the book. But, as we all know, this is for all cancers. But one thing he said in here that I thought, yeah, that's good. He says, on page 88, he says, while I'm fully aware chemo cures cancer in many cases, it's also easy to imagine a time in the not so distant future where our grandsons say, "You did what to people with cancer?" Doctors describe it as a blunt tool for a reason. And I just really, that solidifies why I do what I do with the foundation, with advocating for research, why we do this podcast, why we want awareness, is because we do want our grandchildren to sometime in the not so distant future, as he said, to say, what did you do to people? Like, why did we give people these awful drugs? So
that can kill them, honestly. And at times they're so difficult that it can cause their death.
yes.
We all want that day. Hopefully it'll happen. Well, I would just want to wrap up with kind of why I do what I do. And he talks about it on page 114. And he says, in between Henry's birthday and his death was, of course, his life. That was my favorite part. Henry had a hell of a life. And that's what we're here to celebrate, that the length of anyone's life does not increase its significance in any way.
I love that.
If you both ladies would leave with one thought for somebody who wants to support someone who's going through this, who's lost their child. We've talked a lot about what to say, what not to say, that bringing up their name is not bringing them up. It's always there in your back of your mind. You're always thinking of Nora. But what is something they can do to kind of help support you moving forward? What's something that how can they best be there? And maybe not necessarily what can they say, because there's not really one thing, but how can they best just be there to show up? What would you think?
Not necessarily from a pediatric cancer standpoint, but for any bereaved family, just whenever you see something that reminds you of their child, or you just randomly think of them, just text or call and say, hey, I was just thinking about them today, or this reminded me of them, like my friend did when she sent me that little outfit. Those things are really special and important, and it's not necessarily that you have to do anything that costs money. Of course, obviously I raise money for pediatric cancer, and I will always take your money for pediatric cancer research. Things that don't cost money are just remembering them and telling their family.
And so, Tiffany, I think also we can speak from a perspective of, every loss is so different. And you can find meaningful work in, to help that. So sorry, I'm sure you can hear this. My paper's blowing. Hold on, let me fix this so it doesn't blow. I think that you can do something to find that meaning and to help, even if you're not able to start a foundation. You can also, volunteer for an organization, or for hospice, or at a school, whatever that looks like for you. I think that whenever we help others, it's very healing for ourselves. I know he spoke about the dog that came to the hospital. And, that was just a volunteer in the community that brought her dog to the children's, and that is not a happy place to be, because those kids were incredibly ill there, and a lot of them were dying. And she showed up and brought her dog, and they were present for that. So there's just something that you can do, make lives better, even if your person is gone, regardless if you're, a grieving mother, a 5-year-old sibling, or an 80-year-old widow or widower. There is something that you can do to use your anguish, your grief, your bereavement to make the world a better place.
Absolutely.
Thank you both so much. I know from an outside perspective, this was really enlightening for me, and I think it will be for our listeners too. I really appreciate you, and thank you for joining us, Victoria. If anybody listening needs support in navigating their pediatric cancer journey wishes to be a guest on the podcast, please reach out and let Tiffany and I know.
You can also get involved with the National Pediatric Cancer Foundation through fundraising, promoting awareness, volunteering, or contributing to pediatric cancer research. Just leave a comment or reach out to us via the contact links in the description. Until next time, keep fighting the unexpected fight.